I'm Al Filreis, and this is PoemTalk at the Writer's House, where I have the pleasure of convening three friends in the world of contemporary poetry and poetics to collaborate on a close but not too close reading of a poem. We'll talk, maybe even disagree a bit, and perhaps open up the verse to a few new possibilities. And we hope gain for a poem that interests us, some new readers and listeners. And I say listeners because PoemTalk poems are available in recordings made by the poets themselves as part of our Pen Sound archive, writing.upenn.edu/pensound. Today, I'm in Philadelphia, a few blocks from the Kelly Writer's House, aforementioned, joined here through the quasi-magic of Zoom by Maria Damon, critic, teacher, and poet, textile artist, and contributor to the Digital Poetics movement, whose books include Post-Literary America, From Bagel Shop Jazz to Micro-Poetries, Poetry and Cultural Studies of Reader, which she co-authored with Ira Livingston, and The Dark End of the Street, Margins in American Vanguard Poetry, and who has published chapbooks of textilic visual poems, among them Meshwords and XXX, and by Christopher Stackhouse, whose work includes stage acting, music, recording, painting and drawing, poetry, critical writing, and performance events, whose books include Plural, Seismosis with John Keane, and Slip, whose essay Basquiat and Xerox Art in Context appeared in 2019, and who is a contributor writer for the monograph The Wayland Rudd Collection, Ugly Duckling Press 2020, offering a meditation on the African-American Soviet Union expat actor Wayland, and whose Wayland Rudd, that is, and whose poetry, essays, interviews, exhibition, and book reviews have been published widely in literary journals and arts periodicals, including Hambone, The Volta, Reverie, Midwest African American Literature, Art in America, The Brooklyn Rail, and many, many more. And by Devorah Major, poet, writer of fiction and speculative fiction, who served as San Francisco's third poet laureate, 2002 to 2006, whose seventh book of poetry, Khalifa's Daughter, was published by Willow Press in July of 2020. His other books of poetry include And Then We Became, With More Than Tongue, Where River Meets Ocean, Street Smarts, and others, whose novels are Brown Glass Windows and An Open Weave, the latter the winner of an ALA Black Caucus First Novel Award, whose recent work includes a one-woman poetry performance piece with the working title of Mother's Howl, a new book of poetry called Love in the Hunting Season, and a biography memoir of her father, Reginald Major, tentatively titled A Black Cat. Devorah, I'm breathless with all the stuff you've been doing. Hello and welcome to PoemTalk. Hi.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Yeah, this is your first time on PoemTalk. And Chris, same with you. First time on PoemTalk, and I'm sorry to both of you it's taken this long. How are you?
Good.
Great. Good to see you. And Maria, good to see you as always. Well, today we four have gathered here to talk about a poem by Bob Kaufman, a poem titled Suicide. The text of the poem is most readily available in the Golden Sardine section of collected poems of Bob Kaufman, published by City Lights in 2019 on page 112. The audio recording we'll hear is from a film clip of Kaufman performing the poem outdoors. And the place to see this video is near the end of Billy Woodberry's remarkable documentary film about the life and work of Kaufman, titled, the film is, And When I Die, I Won't Stay Dead. So here now is Bob Kaufman in that clip reciting Suicide.
Suicide, Big Benny and Sonny Benny to you. All that's left is the largest colony of the New World. Who could have guessed it? No one in his right mind. Poets don't sneak into zoos and talk with tigers anymore, even though they read Blake and startle all by striped devices. While those poem of God, point lurking and sun-dried, torn tree jungles, William Blake never saw a tiger and never caught the wind. He got off at 59th Street forever. The first man was an idealist, but he died. He couldn't survive the first truth, discovering that the whole world, all of it was his. He sat down and with a little piece of string and a sharp stone invented suicide.
It's a little hard to hear Kaufman, and if you watch the film, it's a marvelous scene where he is, well, he's kind of Stroman himself. He's wandering around. It looks like a park in San Francisco, but the audio is hard to capture. So I've asked Devorah if she would be willing to read the poem. So we have two audio versions of it for our discussion. Devorah, thank you in advance for doing that.
Suicide. Big Fanny and Strum Bin deal. All that's left of the largest colony of the New World. Who would have guessed it? No one in his right mind. Poets don't sneak into zoos and talk with tigers anymore, even though they read Blake and startle all by striped devices. While those poems of God pout, lurking in sun-dried, torn tree jungles. William Blake never saw a tiger and never fucked a lamb. You get off at 59th Street forever. The first man was an idealist, but he died. He couldn't survive the first truth, discovering that the whole world, all of it, was his. He sat down and with a little piece of string and a sharp stone invented suicide.
Thank you, Devorah. We're going to start in the middle. What's the reference to Blake? And I guess that's the easy part. And then why does that help? Why does that work in that middle stanza? Who wants to talk about Blake? Chris, please.
Yeah. So, I mean, he's clearly mentioning poems from Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience by Blake.
Yeah.
The lamb being from Innocence and the tiger being from Experience. You know, but why he's bringing them up? Well, I thought about it for a bit, just thinking that there is this kind of universal aspect to both the innocence of the lamb and the ferocity, and kind of regal aspect of the tiger, and how one preys upon the other. And you know, critics and scholars have talked about Blake in this way, where there's this constant negotiation between the harsh realities of the world and the more conceptual domain of heaven, and you know, the divine, and how might the divine create contradictory or contrary elements in that human beings, or in his case that man witnesses and has to contend with. So, and I think that that's an element in Kaufman's work throughout his body of work. I think it's very consistent, kind of philosophical questioning of good and evil and morality and ethics. And of course, you know, obviously in his biography, the life of someone who is you know, an ascetic, essentially, is this kind of negotiation with those tensions. So I think that there's a very consistent through line in terms of his understanding or his digesting of Blake, and then being able to put that right back out there in his own work.
Devorah, I want to turn to you. I'm so glad that Chris mentioned the way Kaufman lived his life, spare, ascetic, because it's such a beautiful diss, a beautiful, almost friendly diss to William Blake, who's writing about experience that he never saw a tiger. I just totally love that. Anyway, what do you want to say about this, Devorah?
Well, that's what I was going to say. I felt like it was very much a critique of Blake, that Blake is given a lot of, but like Christopher was saying, you know, in terms of his whole books and meditations on you know, experience and on innocence and all of that. And Kaufman's like, you know, yeah, but none of that was real.
Right.
You know, he doesn't have that experience. He doesn't have that knowledge. He's just writing about it.
Yeah. Maria, it's very charming. It's also, it's a way of saying, you want experience? You want songs of experience? You know, read some of my poems. The tiger, this is the second time the tiger appears in that stanza. The first time is a reference to Michael McClure talking to the tigers in the zoo. So you've got, one of us should spell that out a little bit. It's a great San Francisco cool poetry moment. And then it becomes the Blake tiger. So let's spell that out, maybe Maria and then Chris.
Well, I can't honestly say that much about McClure, but I can certainly, through McClure, get to Ginsberg, who in a way is the figure who ties all of this together.
Yeah.
He was very good friends with Kaufman. Well, reasonably good friends with Kaufman. They certainly knew each other and respected each other. And McClure, of course, was a San Francisco beat poet who also read with Ginsberg at the Six Gallery. And McClure was also good friends with Kaufman. I believe there are tapes of taking place at George Kaufman, the older brother's house, in which McClure and Kaufman are, Bob Kaufman are both guests, and they're kind of shooting the breeze about Kaufman's life. I agree that it's a critique of Blake, but I think it's also a way of creating a lineage between Blake and the poets with whom Kaufman is in current conversation.
Yeah. He says poets don't sneak into zoos anymore, as if the days of that kind of
As if they ever did.
are over. But indeed they did. Michael McClure in 1964 and again in 1966 sneaked into the San Francisco Zoo and started to sing to the tigers, famously. So there's this recording of him, and Ghost Tantras records that. And that would have been like a really signal moment. So it's wonderful that that crazy ass thing that Michael McClure did doesn't happen anymore. So Chris, can you figure out the tone of this second stanza? Is he missing the days of bold avant-garde? Is he tracing that cowardice back to Blake's failure to really experience? What's the tone? What's he trying to convey about the situation for poets who like to live at the edge?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about his, the colony and New World and the idea of strolling through it. I do get the humor, and I love Kaufman for his humor. He speaks about death and race and the violence of the Western world with, a great deal of humor and kind of lightness. Right on the flip side of that is a razor sharp edge, which is critical of the West, actually. And so I think that in many ways, the reference to Blake, McClure notwithstanding, is also critical of the West. And it's an interesting thing. I pulled out a couple of different versions of Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. And right after The Lamb, in a couple of different editions, is a poem called The Little Black Boy, where Blake addresses racial disparity and colonialism, and he talks about it in a way that really deals with it through the Christ metaphor, through the God metaphor. And the tiger and the lamb are also somewhat biblically referential, and so there's a layered critique in that bit. Yeah, so there's a humorous element that I did pick up on. I have to say, because of the way that I read Kaufman and how I spend time putting his words in my mouth, I always get that lyrical sadness. And so he's kind of like he's a strange kind of bardic figure where it is about joy, in some ways, of the joy of living and the joy of refusing so much, but it's also just looking at the loss and the difficulty of being a person in his skin, hence the title.
Yeah, thank you, Devorah. Chris just brought up the Stroman of the first stanza, so can we talk about that? I'm sorry, I'm so disconnected from first of all, from San Francisco, and second, from I had to look up Stroman, is what I'm saying. And what I found was to saunter erratically, aimlessly, as if high or drunk. What do we make of this? I mean, this is so Kaufman-esque. What do we make of this opening? It's quite remarkable. and it's emphasized by the film clip, because I believe he's just kind of walking around, maybe in a park, and someone's asking him to recite this poem, and it happens somewhat spontaneously. So he's actually strumming when he performs it.
Well, I think a couple things. One, I don't think this whole poem takes place in San Francisco. There's no 59th Street in San Francisco.
Right, absolutely.
Right,
I think that's New York.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that while he might be remembering or knowing that Michael McClure snuck into zoos,
Yeah.
he doesn't say Michael McClure. He says poets.
Right.
So I think he's talking about, in a way, poets squaring up. You know,
Yeah.
this was a hip thing they did. They're not doing it now.
Yes.
Okay, and I think it's really, and again, and I think that the Big Fanny and Strum and Vinny, and I agree. I was looking at that, and I really thought about it, and Christopher, because all I could think about is he talking about somebody with a big butt, you know, because that's the way we use the language.
Yeah.
And if Kaufman was anything, yes, he was a poet, but he was a black man. And he was very pointedly a black man, and in his poetry, in his life, everywhere. Not that he wasn't on the beach scene, that he didn't hang out in North Beach, yada, yada, yada. But he hung out with black men too. White people don't talk about that way, maybe because they weren't there. But that's a part of his history too. So when I look at this poem, I don't think of it as a San Francisco poem.
Mm.
It's a Kaufman poem that references something that happened in San Francisco, or maybe happened in New York zoos too. I don't know. Something that also, in terms of New York, and when you get off the train and what the stop is there that people get off at forever, you know, I feel like there's all of those layers to it, you know, and the layer. And when you're talking about deal, somebody who deals, Big Fanny and Strom and Vinny dealing has to do with drugs.
Right.
It's not, they're not dealing cards.
So
they're not making a deal.
I'm glad you widened the terrain here, because that makes sense. The largest colony of the New World. This is a big continental statement. And then that marvelous line, Maria, who could have guessed it?
Yeah.
And we don't know quite what it is, but what we've, presumably it refers to what's happened in the previous lines. And then this great line, no one in his right mind, meaning no one in his right mind would have guessed it. Can you try to spell that out a little bit? I understand that there is a kind of reversal of the value of unreason. Unreason is actually being in your right mind in a situation like this, but can you help us out?
Well, I think there's a kind of part of the pleasure of his work is the sort of paradoxical nature of it. Mm. So this reversal of, let's say, sanity and insanity is something that he does quite a bit. Who's inside, who's outside, who's sane, who's mad, who's in jail, who isn't in jail. Right. And he's doing it here. And I also appreciate that what's left of the largest colony in the New World is basically a drug deal. It's really a sort of like, it's come to this kind of a statement.
Who could have guessed it? You're saying, I think, who could have guessed it is, who could have guessed that this is what would become this large colony? Yeah. And the only person who could have guessed it is Kaufman. No one who is deemed to be in his right mind. He's basically, Chris, telling us from the start that he's in his, marginal, supposedly not in right mind position. He's actually to be trusted here. He's going to be wise about this particular colony. So I wonder if we could go to the third stanza, Chris, because that seems to be, Genesis and Adam and starting over and all that stuff.
Can I say one thing, Chris?
Please.
I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be rude, but I just wanted to say I don't agree with you.
Yeah, okay.
Who could have guessed it? Why is he saying I guessed it? Yeah. He's saying I'm looking at this now. Who could have guessed it then? Mm. I don't know that he's saying I'm wise and I guessed it.
Yeah, the who is, I actually get the who is more general, kind of an open, who would have thought? Kind of almost like an exclamatory phrase in a way. Who would have guessed it?
Yeah,
I thought it was could possibly be he was giving credit to Big Fanny and Strom and Vinny, that it's the people on the outside who actually know what's going on. They know the ways in which
Fanny,
their sort of furtive street culture is a complete mirror of the colonizing processes.
The first man was an idealist, but he died. He couldn't survive the fresh truth, discovering that the whole world, all of it was his. He sat down and with a little piece of string and a sharp stone invented suicide.
This is just kind of out of left field. I love the string and a sharp stone.
Oh, yeah.
The string reminded me immediately of stringed instruments, and buried in sharp, I got harp right away. And because he's a jazz guy and he listens very closely to sound and music and meaning and how those things pair up, it would be very easy for him to place harp in sharp and make that reference to the string and stone. And, and stone could be anything. It could be a drum. It could also be, a guitar pick. It's very, again, very, very interesting stuff. And I think the last part to answer your question, Al, is that it just goes to the isolated or the lonely individual in a very complex space, contemplating a kind of mortality in the face of something that was supposed to be all about new life,
Yeah.
in the world.
Thank you. Devorah and Maria, let's please stay on this thing that Chris mentioned. There is, at least as a second meaning, this idea of music at the end. I'm very moved by the end because it seems like, your first feeling about inventing suicide, Devorah, is a string, it's a way to kill yourself, and a sharp stone, a sharp object, a way to kill yourself. And yet then I thought there's music, and that would be very sad, that music, that, a person realizing that he or she is a poet, an artist, could lead to, self-harm. It's just very powerful the way that thing ends. So can we talk more about the ending and this first man at the beginning of the stanza?
Well, what captured me, I had to say, my father used to recite the third stanza from when I was a child, because he and Kaufman were friends. So that was he had the book, and he would, and
Wow.
I was mystified by it. I was just like, oh my goodness, really? And I would ask my dad about it. And one of the things that came, it was just like, and actually I misread it when I read it, the whole world was all his. And that here, and it's such a, we have this incredible world. It's all yours. And what do? You invent suicide. And I think that I think earlier, Chris, you talked about a certain sadness, that's in the poems. And I think that, to me, that's what's really important there, is there's that, instead of going, oh my goodness, look at this. Look at this incredible world. Mine, it's all mine. Look at what I can do. I can sing, I can make music, I can wonder. But no, what do? I take a string and a sharp rock. Yes, I could make music.
Yeah.
But what I do is I commit suicide.
That is so powerful. And why do you think your dad, why was that the stanza he would recite? Did he have anything to say about why, or he just loved that poem?
Well, I think there is that sense. I mean, it was always, I was brought up in a very political household, this sense of how wonderful the planet Earth would be if we weren't divided. People, let me not go around the bush. If white people were not so busy oppressing Black people and other people of color, the wonder of the world. And so that this idea that one invented the bomb, all of these things
Right.
in the face of this world of wonder. And we spent a great deal of time out in California. My father's from New York City. He was born at Harlem Hospital. So when he came out here, we were all the time in nature. We were at Big Sur and all these wonderful places in California. And so for him, it was like the world was so beautiful and all of it was his. So I think that he was really taken by the fact that here's this idealist that couldn't cope with their own wealth.
Ah,
Not money wealth, true
yeah,
wealth.
yeah. I'm curious. The first truth, when I first read this poem, I thought, well, we're not going to know exactly what he means by that. But I think maybe it's the first truth is what follows.
Yeah.
That is, i.e., discovering that the whole world was his. That's the first truth.
The idea of dying is the very first truth. You know, right after it, he's an idealist, but he died.
Yeah.
That's the first ultimate truth right there.
Yeah, I mean that's how it is, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're right. It's the Genesis story. You know, you're born into all this beauty, and you discover knowledge, which is that all of this is yours. And the very next thing that you know, you have existential angst. And I think that's another thing that I think also is very present in Kaufman's poetry, is a particular inflection of the kind of ideas that were circulating in American highbrow to middlebrow popular culture around existentialism, loneliness, the word alienation moving from a Marxist term having to do with labor. And of course, Kaufman was a labor organizer and a labor orator. And then the word alienation became depoliticized. And that suicide is a kind of, there's an aura around it in existential thought. But it's also the sort of end point of a culture that doesn't deserve itself, in a sense. A culture that's let itself down. This is extremely layered to me, and it brings together kind of philosophical ideas of the time, his autobiography, the history of U.S. politics. I mean, everything is right here. And yes, you can write. Well, I was thinking writing. What do you do with a sharp stone? You write with it. You inscribe on a surface with it.
Oh, yeah. That's why, Maria, when I saw he sat down, it's my favorite phrase in that stanza. He sat down, meaning, okay, the first man did this and that. He didn't discovered the first truth and sat down. And essentially, Chris sat down and created, sat down and had the tools to now create. That's good, strong evidence of that reading that Maria just said, that these are the tools of creation. And then ironically, as Devorah pointed out, also the tools by which you get rid of yourself. Chris, do you want to comment further on this?
Just a couple things that, in agreement. I wrote down loneliness, existential alienation before you said it. And because it's that clear. It's very clear.
Everywhere.
And I think about suicide as relief, that the invention of it, if you know that the end is a death, where everything that you come to know is cast to oblivion, why don't you go ahead and take the reins yourself, and take control and do that for yourself. But so those are two things I thought of to further both Devorah and Maria's ideas. Yeah.
I think that this is, in a way, this is where I go round and round and round with Kaufman. And in the critical literature on him, it's always this, well, was he a victim of U.S. racism? Yes, of course he was. Did he take matters into his own hands and recreate himself in this powerful way? Yes, he did. But to what extent is his life a tragic story, and to what extent is his life one of endless possibility and resilience? It just, and most of the stuff I see written about him, and I have to say, I am guilty of this myself, there's sometimes a somewhat glib tendency to exalt the the abject situation that he found himself in, or that, that his life became. He was very well loved, and people in the community did take care of him. But there were other poets like Amiri Baraka who were outraged and who would say, look at what they did to this poet. Yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say that the thing about it is Kaufman was in San Francisco. He was doing his thing. He had made various hookups with various people. He had, in North Beach, there was a community of black men, and he hung out with them, and then he hung out with the poets who became the beat poets. And then he took a trip to the East Coast with Kesey and them, not the on the road trip, another trip he took. And they turned him on to meth. He did not use drugs. He smoked weed, he drank. That made him somewhat crazy. He got to New York, they put him in Bellevue and gave him shock therapy. He was forever changed. But how he got on that road was not him. It was not self-sabotage. It was not him into drugs. He got turned out. And I think that's a part of the story that's really important, because he didn't just get there. And then people got him out of Bellevue. But when you've had shock therapy, especially the way they did it then, they don't get back again. Things are taken out, things are missing. So when he returned to San Francisco, he returned with that. And what did he do? I don't know if he was on his way to becoming a Buddhist, or if he was, he became a Buddhist. He contributed to building a Buddhist temple in San Francisco. That there's this other life he had. I'm not sure whether or not the labor, what you said, is a loss. I just don't know. Maybe so, maybe not, because he, as well as he could, stayed active. But it's hard. I mean, what was he arrested 56, 57 times in San Francisco? It was absurd. It was like, oh, there's Kaufman on the street. Let's beat him up and throw him in jail.
Yeah.
So when you looking at this poetry, to me, that's the backstory that sometimes slips out in corners of the poems.
Mm.
But to look at that, I think what Chris said earlier about the first truth, yes, people died. And yes, what you said, oh, wow, people die anyway. I can just jump on into it. But that was not something that Bob did. He held on.
For much longer. I mean, the evidence for me, as a generation later, the evidence is he hung on a lot longer than he probably should have and probably really wanted to. I mean, there's a perseverance. I do think, I was, and in some ways I try to skirt around the issue of race, because it's it's just such a huge topic, and it's hard to really ever, you could have that conversation about nearly every element of our contemporary life, period. So it's obvious, but I think in this case, when we look at Kaufman, you have to think about him being a black man. You have to think about him being a very beautiful black man who could, dated interracially, really tried to pursue integration in a very forward progressive way, and then finds it complicated, and then finds himself, his real self, his true self, rejected, which I think is hard to really comprehend. That a lot of times, if you are a black person and you move into a space that is considered let's just say, take it, crazy, the way that people think of it this way, but the white space is the universal space. So if you're a black person and you try to move into, black male, try to move into a universal space, you are challenged, because people want you to leave the blackness out of the experience. They want you to leave it out. And that creates a kind of psychological problem, because you're only bringing part of yourself into something. And you may think, especially if you're progressive as he was, that, well, I'll leave this little bit out so I can further the agenda of black life by just leaving this little bit out so I can make room for others to come in. And by the time they get there, there'll be enough space cut for them to be themselves. It's very, very dangerous space to be. I think and I'm just thinking about this as we're talking about it, particularly both Maria's mentioned, notation of scholarship, and Devorah's kind of thinking about her dad and her dad reading it and communism and all of this stuff, is I think about the protagonist from The Invisible Man, Ellison's Invisible Man. He goes through that. Like he goes into, he starts off fighting for the white woman, with the guy in the boxing ring, another black kid. And then he gets, the liberals end up loving him and understanding where he's coming from, and they bring him into the Communist Party, et cetera, et cetera. And by the time it's all over, he doesn't know his fingers, his toes from his ankles. Like, he's totally lost. And so, in a way, the poetry is the way out. It is actually the way that's left, let's go there,
Yeah.
This is his brilliance, right? I mean, a lot of people were driven out of the labor movement, and a lot of people suffered in that way, but they were not able to reinvent themselves and, have a whole second, completely different life. And, and this is actually, I just want to quote my favorite Kaufman line, which is, way out people know the way out.
Right.
And there you have it. That's what you just said. So, and in fact, I was thinking just to sort of support this idea of a redemptive writing. I mean, I can argue it both ways because I feel both ways are true. With a little piece of string and a sharp stone, you can do a lot of things, but I don't really understand. I mean, you can harm yourself, but that's not really a suicide method. A little piece of string and a sharp stone.
Yeah, right.
I mean, you would need a rope, and
Yeah.
There's something so brilliant about the ambiguity of it.
I think he's telling us there that he doesn't mean this to be a pre-elegy. This is not about himself, as Chris was talking about. He was amazingly persistent, living much longer than the first man, and I first went into this thinking about this poem, thinking about this as kind of a self-reference, a way out. But in fact, now hearing you folks talk about this, I realize that this poem ends with something of affirmation, may be too strong a word, but something of the discovery or invention or creation of a way to express. And I love the percussion and the string together there. So it's really, really positively musical at the end. Listen, I wonder if we could go around one more time and offer final thoughts, something that you had come to this conversation intending to say, but haven't had a chance yet. So it can be totally random, just a final thought. Devorah, do you want to start? Is there something you wanted to say that we haven't talked about yet?
No, I don't think there was, but I do think that what Chris just said in terms of, is really vital in terms of the having to leave a part of himself out. And then if we combine that with what you mentioned, Al, about the possibility of using a stone to write, because as you just said, Maria, one can't kill oneself with string and a stone. Well, I mean, if you're determined, you could probably kill yourself with anything. But generally, that one has to wonder if there isn't a somewhat implicit thing of that writing oneself and writing oneself out, which is its own kind of suicide.
Wow. Oh, that was great. Thank you. Maria, do you have a final thought?
Well, it just occurred to me that this business of sacrifice, cutting with a sharp stone, first man, etc., brings up for me Isaac and Abraham, which in turn refers us back to the lamb. The lamb is a sacrificial creature who replaces the son. And there's a lot of writing in Kaufman about fathers and sons. But then the ways in which writing come to replace the animal sacrifice and singing and praise and so on. So I'm sort of seeing these three stanzas initially seem to me to be very like fragments brought together somehow. But now I'm seeing more of a continuity with the notion of self-sacrifice, animal sacrifice, substitution, and sublimation, with writing kind of off being the final creative version, generative version of sacrifice. So.
Fantastic. Thank you. Chris, a final thought?
Yeah, I just want to read a poem of his that's very short.
Please.
And it's, I think you guys probably heard this one before. It's called Why Write About? And written in 1967. And it goes, write hung things, mad mess, zen tree joy, dad, like, you know, swung out cats hung on publicity, like, you know, sick middle class chicks, nympho, caucasoids, eating symbols, little old boys in Monday beards, attending all the schools of self-pity, selling their right to revolution, to a piece of, like, you know, man, it's a scene, like, you know, the mother bit, genetic complications, like, man, like, man, like.
So good. The jazz, I mean, that's with the rhythm that I heard in that second stanza when he says, you get out the 59th Street forever. That's a bebop rhythm.
It is. I can't get out of my head Chris's earlier point about the, very conscious making of sounds and beats and rhythms here. And I think you implied that Stroman is kind of what he was doing in the writing. That is to say, that seemingly erratic sauntering.
Walking.
Walking, right. I've never seen a poet do the seeming erratic sauntering in writing quite like this poem. It's an amazing
or like walking like on the bass, you know, walking on the bass.
Yes, that's what we use. We use the word walking to refer to that. And then it ends with a string instrument.
Stride piano.
It's just fantastic. It's just amazing. My final thought has to do with jail poems. I've been reading the documents that you can get, some through scholars and some are just online, and some I took screenshots from the documentary, reading documents pertaining to some of the arrests, and then thinking about there's a couple of scholars. Smethurst is one who's been working on documenting all the left-wing connections, which are very serious. They're early. And then rereading jail poems, thinking about that. And there's one jail poem, it's only 2 lines that I want to read, that I've reread, reinterpreted based on that and based on this discussion today. It's number 34 out of the 35, written in jail in 1915. And I think, Devorah, the latest count of arrests is 59.
Okay.
59 arrests, most of them just police coming and hitting him and taking him away. So he wrote this on one of those visits. The defective on the floor, mumbling, was once a man who shouted across tables.
Yep.
Now, I brought that to my students the other day, and I said, well, who is that man? And they all said, oh, it's some crazy guy who's just yelling. And then I realized, no, that's an organizer. That man used to be a political person who shouted across tables, meaning was willing to get you into an argument about politics. And now he's the defective on the floor, defective in quotes. Kaufman would never use that word without irony, far from defective, mumbling. And I guess what Kaufman is saying in jail poems is we have to start learning how to listen to the mumbling, because in the mumbling of this so-called defective person is some real politics. And I'm glad I'm in jail not glad I'm in jail, but I feel lucky to be in jail to meet this ex-radical who's been beaten up. Well, we like to end Poem Talk with a minute or two of Gathering Paradise, which is a chance for us to gather put our hands together and gather something really poetically good to hail or commend someone or something going on in the poetry world or the art world. So it's a recommendation, basically. Maria, are you ready to recommend?
Well, this is not anything new and current, but I was looking at this in the last couple of years, and most specifically last week.
And you say, can you read the title out?
Yes, it's Conversations with Ogo Temeli. It's about the mythology of the Dogon people of Mali. And although, mediated by this French anthropologist, Marcel Griol, it's a treasure of intricacy and integrated world cosmology. And it's also, if you're interested in the work of Nathaniel Mackey, he is very cognizant and conversant with the Dogon cosmology and uses it a lot.
In the Song of the Ongambulu in particular, yeah.
And the other thing I want to share, I'm sorry, but this is about me, because now I can't share it any other way other than through these Zoom meetings. This is a weaving that color codes the DNA sequence of the silkworm. So,
wow.
And it's very long.
Wow.
So, yeah, it goes.
Where's that going to go when you're done with it?
Well, it goes all the way through here, and then it sort of starts over again. It was intended to be shown at a conference that celebrated the work of poet Anne Blonstein, who at the time that she died was working on a long poem based on the silkworm DNA sequence. But this is eventually going to be with her collected papers in the SUNY Buffalo Special Collections.
Wonderful.
But of course, the conference was canceled because of COVID, so this is just sitting in my house.
Lovely. If you take a photo of it, I will post it with the program notes for this podcast episode in Jacket 2. Be happy to display it photographically, or even a short video. Christopher Stackhouse, Gather Some Paradise, please.
An old friend of mine named Mark Nichols, who's a poet turned nurse. He worked in finance for a while, but I don't know what he's doing now. But he wrote a book years ago called Cicada, and I forget who published it. But Mark Nichols, Cicada, I've been reading it over and over again, pulling poems out of there, here and there. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful book of poetry. I mean, you don't see people, it's rare to read people who aren't thinking about it from a theoretical standpoint. They're just writing, and just writing about their lives and what's happening with them. And it was published years ago. I think it was published in 99 or 2000. Maybe it was 2000 by Rataplex, if I'm not mistaken. So I would say if anyone can get their hands on that book, you should definitely get that book. It's relieving for our times, I'll say that. And then the project I'm working on, the Waylon Rudd collection, I have one essay in it, but there's several other essays and pieces in it. And I think that's something that is worth looking into right now, particularly because, it deals with expat African-American, going to Russia, coming back to the United States for a couple of years, only to return for the rest of his life back to Russia. He left in 1930, came back to the States in 32, and then went back to Russia in 34 and stayed. And yeah, I haven't seen all of the essays that are in it. I've read a couple. I'm very, very interested in finding out how other people are treating this through writing and through the images in the book. It's a monograph of propaganda posters from Russia dealing with trying to convince Africans and blacks in the colonies of the West to come to the Soviet Union at the time. So.
Congratulations for being part of that book, and it's coming out soon after we're talking. A few months.
I believe it's coming out before the year's end. If not before the year's end, probably before spring. So.
I forgot to thank you. A few years ago, when John Keane visited the Kelly Writers House, I taught my students seismosis, which is another book that's a little hard to find these days. And your drawings for that are just fantastic, really just beautiful. And I never had a chance to tell you that. So,
thanks.
Seismosis. Devorah Major, Gather Some Paradise, please.
Well, I wanted to say, since we've been talking about Kaufman, that if people haven't ever listened or haven't listened recently, they should go back and listen to some Charlie Parker and some Ray Charles, which inform. There are other musicians too, but so much of his work, those two are very important. And if you haven't listened in a while, it's very healing and sustaining. And Willow Press is coming out with an anthology next year, I believe, called The New Black Fire. And Black Fire was a compendium of Black poetry put out in, Chris, the 70s? I think the 70s.
I actually have that book. Yeah, I believe it's the 70s.
I think it was like early though, and so now they're looking at it again. So what's the new Black Fire, which I think is really exciting, because I think very often there's a way we cleave ourselves from the past instead of kind of weaving into it in the arts world. We might individually reference the past, but, and so I'm very excited that they're doing, looking at it again and looking at it from where are we now.
Fantastic. Great suggestions. My Gathering Paradise is the kind of an obvious one. It's the collected poems of Bob Kaufman. It's out fairly recently, 2019, from City Lights. It's really, really fantastic. And I wanted to conclude by referring to the Abominist Manifesto. It's one of my favorite. I think that's 1959, Bob Kaufman. And since our election is coming up, of course, I want to read a few lines from Abominist Election Manifesto. Just a few of the items. 1, Abominists vote against everyone by not voting for anyone. By the way, we're not recommending that, and in fact, I'm sure Bob Kaufman wasn't recommending that. Number 3, Abominists demand the abolition of Oakland. 5, Abominists demand suppression of illegal milk traffic. 6, this is funny, Abominists demand statehood for North Beach. 7, the only office Abominists run for is the unemployment office. I love that. Well, that is all the invention of pieces of string and sharp stones we have time for on Poem Talk today. Poem Talk at the Writers' House is a collaboration of the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing, the Kelly Writers' House at the University of Pennsylvania, the Poetry Foundation, poetryfoundation.org. Thanks so much, so much to my guests, Maria Damon, Christopher Stackhouse, and Devorah Major, and to Poem Talk's director and engineer, today Zach Hardner, and to Poem Talk's editor, the same amazing Zach Hardner, and a shout out to Nathan and Elizabeth Light for their very generous support of Poem Talk. In our next episode, I'm going to be joined by Tracy Morris, Douglas Kearney, and Derek Bayou to talk about 2 pieces by B.P. Nickel. One is called Dada Llama, and the other is called A Small Song That Is His. This is Al Filreis, and I hope you'll join us for that or another episode of Poem Talk.